There's a kind of grief that does not arrive all at once. It does not knock loudly or announce itself at the front door. It comes slowly, like the tide rolling in at night when no one is watching, and by morning, the ground beneath your feet has shifted in ways you cannot quite explain. That is what happened on September 8th, 2022, when the news broke that Queen Elizabeth II had died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, surrounded by the people who loved her most. The world heard it as a headline. But for Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, it was not a headline. It was the closing of a door that had always been open to them, a door that would never open again. And somehow, the whole world felt it too. To understand why the days that followed moved so many millions of people, you have to understand what Queen Elizabeth II meant. Not just to Britain, but to the idea of continuity itself. She had reigned for 70 years. 70 years. She had been on the throne longer than most living people had been alive. She had weathered wars, scandals, divorces, political upheaval, and a world that changed around her so completely it was almost unrecognizable. Through all of it, she had remained. A fixed point. A North Star that people had grown so used to looking up at that they had stopped really noticing it was there, until the night it disappeared from the sky. For William, the loss was layered in ways no camera could fully capture. He had lost his mother, Princess Diana, when he was only 15 years old. He had grown up knowing what it felt like to have the rug pulled out from under your life in a single moment. His grandmother had been the one who held the family together in the years after Diana's death. She had done it quietly, without speeches or grand gestures, in the way that very strong people often do things, simply by being present, by continuing, by not falling apart. William had watched her do this for his entire life. She was not just his queen. She was the person who had shown him, without ever saying so directly, that duty and love were not opposites, that you could hold both in the same hands at the same time, even when they were heavy. Catherine had spent 20 years learning from her. 20 years of guidance, of quiet wisdom passed across private dinners and formal engagements alike. Catherine was not born into the royal family. She had arrived as a young woman from a middle-class family in Berkshire, carrying herself with a natural grace that the Queen had recognized early. The relationship between them was not spoken about loudly, but those who were close to the palace understood it clearly. The Queen had seen something in Catherine that she trusted, a steadiness, a genuine warmth toward people that did not perform itself. And Catherine, for her part, had leaned on that quiet approval more than the public ever knew. When Queen Elizabeth died, Catherine lost her most important mentor. The morning after the Queen's death, Buckingham Palace released an official statement. It was formal, careful, measured. But the statement William released spoke differently. He called her an extraordinary woman and said her commitment to service and duty has been an example to us all. He said his 3 children have been able to spend holidays with her and create memories that will last their whole lives. He said he would grieve her loss, but that he also felt grateful. The word grateful, sitting there alongside the word grieve, told the whole story, because that is exactly how it feels to lose someone who lived a full and magnificent life. The grief and the gratitude do not cancel each other out. They exist together, side by side, the way 2 rivers can run parallel without ever merging. In the days that followed, Britain entered a period of mourning unlike anything the modern world had seen. People began arriving at the gates of Buckingham Palace carrying flowers. Within hours, the flowers were piled so high and so deep that staff had to keep creating new pathways through them just to keep the pavement clear. The queues to view the Queen lying in state stretched for miles. For miles, 5 miles, eventually reaching as far as Southwark Park. People waited for 12 hours, sometimes 14, in the cold autumn air. They waited in silence, mostly, or in hushed conversations with the strangers beside them. Nobody was forcing them to be there. Nobody had organized them. They had simply come from every part of the country and from countries far beyond it because they needed somewhere to put what they were feeling. William and Catherine understood this need better than almost anyone. On the Saturday after the Queen's death, just 3 days after she had passed, They did something that surprised many people. They stepped outside Windsor Castle and walked, almost unannounced, toward the crowds. They did not make a formal appearance. They did not stand behind a podium or deliver a prepared statement. They simply walked out and started talking to people. They stopped at individual mourners. They read the handwritten notes attached to the flower arrangements. They received cards and small gifts from children who had been brought to pay their respects. Catherine crouched down to the eye level of a little girl who had come with her parents and spoke to her gently while the crowds pressed quietly around them. The images from that afternoon broke something open in people, because this was not the expected behavior of a prince and princess who had just inherited the heaviest titles of their lives. William was now the Prince of Wales. He was the heir apparent to the British throne. The world was watching every move he made, calculating, measuring, wondering whether he was ready. And instead of retreating behind palace walls to prepare himself for the enormous responsibility that was now formally his, he had walked out into the cold afternoon and let a complete stranger show him a photograph of her late mother, and stood there looking at it with full attention and real care. That is not nothing. That is everything. There's a phrase that gets used often in conversations about the royal family, about whether they are in touch with ordinary people, whether they understand what real life actually feels like. It is a reasonable question. It is hard to maintain genuine human connection when you live inside institutions as large and formal and ancient as those that surround the British monarchy. Protocols, schedules, advisors, barriers, all of it creating a kind of insulation between the person and the world. But what William and Catherine showed on that September afternoon, walking through the flowers and the grief and the quiet murmuring crowds, was that the insulation had not taken hold. Not fully. Not in the ways that mattered most. There were tears in the crowds that day. Not all of them for the Queen. Some of them, it seemed, were for the sight of a young couple carrying something enormous on their shoulders, and choosing, in spite of all of it, to carry it toward the people rather than away from them. The week moved on. The logistics of a state funeral of this scale are almost incomprehensibly complex. Heads of state from across the world were arriving in London. Thousands of security personnel were deployed. The ceremonial schedule was timed down to the minute, every procession route calculated, every position confirmed. But inside all of that vast, formal machinery, the human moments kept breaking through. William asked his two eldest children, 9-year-old George and 7-year-old Charlotte, if they wanted to attend the funeral. He gave them a choice. A small detail, but an important one. He did not want them to carry a grief they had not been prepared for. But he also believed, as Catherine believed, that honoring a life this significant, a life that had shaped their own in ways they would only understand fully as they grew older, was worth something. Worth the difficulty. Worth the formality. Worth standing in a place of immense sadness as a family and doing it together. They said yes. In the quiet of the days leading up to September 19th, London was changing. The city took on a strange, suspended quality. People who lived and worked there described it as feeling somehow both smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because everyone was moving more gently, speaking more softly, as though some collective agreement had been reached about the appropriate weight of footsteps. Larger because the crowds had transformed the familiar geography of streets. The Mall, the road that runs from Buckingham Palace to Trafalgar Square, had become a sea of flowers and people and silence. It looked like something out of a painting that had not been painted yet. And in the center of all of it, two people were preparing themselves for a day that no amount of royal upbringing could have fully prepared them for. William had walked in a funeral procession before. He had done it as a 15-year-old boy, behind the coffin of his mother, on a September morning not entirely unlike this one. He had walked behind that coffin for what felt like forever, in front of the entire watching world, holding himself together with a discipline that no 15-year-old should ever have to call upon. That morning had been written into him at the deepest level. It had shaped him in ways that were still shaping him now. He was going to walk again, and this time, Catherine would be beside him. The morning of September 19th, 2022 arrived the way significant mornings often do, quietly, without any of the drama they are about to contain. London was cool and gray. The kind of sky that does not decide between rain and cloud, that simply settles into a pale, flat light and stays there. Long before dawn, the city had begun filling. People had slept on pavements wrapped in sleeping bags and blankets to secure their spot along the route. By 6 in the morning, every vantage point from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey was occupied. Barriers ran for miles. Officers stood at intervals along every stretch of road. The silence that had settled over London during the days of mourning had not lifted. If anything, it had deepened overnight, as though the city itself had breathed in and was holding it. Inside Buckingham Palace and in the private rooms of Windsor Castle, the royal family was preparing. The clothes alone told a story. Every item had been chosen with the kind of deliberate care that turned what you wore into a form of communication. William arrived in his RAF No. 1 uniform, the garter sash worn across his chest, his RAF pilot's wings pinned to the left. The uniform was not ceremonial decoration. It was a statement of identity. He was a military man as well as a prince. He had earned those wings. He had flown search and rescue helicopters in Wales. He had pulled people out of the sea. The uniform said something about who he understood himself to be beneath the titles, and wearing it to say goodbye to his grandmother was a way of bringing that self to her funeral, not just the future king. Catherine wore black, a long, fitted coat dress with a pearl necklace and small pearl earrings that had once belonged to the queen. The pearls were not announced. No one put out a press release pointing at them and explaining the gesture. The pearls simply appeared. They're on her ears, and people who were paying close attention recognized them. Those who knew understood immediately. Those who did not know felt something about her without being able to say exactly what it was, a sense of connection, of care, of a woman honoring something private in the middle of a very public day. George wore a suit for the first time, his small frame pulled into it with all the solemn neatness of a 9-year-old who understood the significance of the occasion, even if the full weight of it was still assembling itself in his mind. Charlotte wore a diamond horseshoe brooch pinned to her coat, a gift from her great-grandmother. Her mother had fastened it on that morning, pressing it carefully into the fabric, smoothing it down, her hands pausing for just a moment on her daughter's small shoulder. They stepped outside into the gray morning and took their places in the procession. The coffin was carried on the state gun carriage of the Royal Navy. It moved slowly, pulled by naval ratings, through streets that had been transformed into something that felt more like a held breath than a public space. The sound of the procession was extraordinary in its strangeness. The low, rhythmic rumble of the carriage, the measured footfalls of the military escort, the distant toll of Big Ben, and, underneath all of it, the silence of hundreds of thousands of people who had come to watch, and were now standing perfectly still. No cheating, no calling out. Only the occasional sound of quiet weeping from someone who had stopped being able to hold it in. William walked behind the coffin. He had done this before. He knew the mechanics of it, how to place your feet, how to hold your head, how to keep your face composed when what you actually want to do is stop walking and just stand somewhere quietly for a while. He knew the strange doubled consciousness of public grief, the way you could be simultaneously inside your own feelings and watching yourself from the outside, aware of the cameras, aware of the watching world, aware that the way you carry yourself in this particular moment will be recorded and played back for years. He knew all of that. And still, at certain moments along that route, his composure shifted. It did not break, but it shifted. There were seconds, barely seconds, when something moved across his face that no amount of training could have smoothed away completely. A tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the mouth, the way a person looks when they're processing something that is arriving faster than they can process it. Those micro moments were caught by cameras and broadcast to millions of people watching at home. And those people recognized what they were seeing not because they were watching a prince, but because they were watching a human being walking through grief, and human beings know what that looks like from the inside. Catherine walked separately from William in the procession, as royal protocol required, in the carriage with Queen Consort Camilla, and the Countess of Wessex. But she was there, present in the same collective movement, and she held Charlotte's hand as they arrived at Westminster Abbey. That detail, a mother's hand reaching for her daughters as they crossed the threshold of one of the most solemn spaces in Britain, was the detail that undid people completely. Not the ceremony, not the grandeur, the hand. Inside Westminster Abbey, over 2,000 people were gathered. World leaders, heads of state, former prime ministers, diplomats from more than 100 countries. The building was full to its ancient walls, and yet the architecture of the service found ways to create intimacy inside the enormity. The singing of Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, which had also been sung at William and Catherine's wedding in that same abbey 11 years earlier, moved through the space and through the people in it in a way that collapsed time briefly, making the wedding and the funeral exist in the same room at the same moment, joy and grief folded into the same melody. William sat in his pew and did not look around. He looked forward or downward at his hands at the stone floor. The kind of looking that is actually not looking at anything, but is instead a way of holding yourself steady while the world tilts. He was thinking about his grandmother, the conversations that would not happen again, the lunches at Windsor, the moments of private counsel she had offered him across the years of his adult life, never telling him what to do, but always managing to ask precisely the right question at exactly the right time, the kind of question that made you realize you already knew the answer and had simply not been brave enough to say it out loud. She had been teaching him his whole life without ever making him feel like a student. The service lasted approximately 1 hour. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered the address. The choir sang. The congregation rose and sat and rose again in the ancient choreography of Anglican ritual. The last post was played, that short, devastating fanfare that has sounded over every British military funeral for more than a century, rising and then folding into silence so complete it felt physical. 2 minutes passed without a sound. Not a cough, not a whisper, not the shuffling of a foot. 2,000 people and the whole of a watching world holding silence together. Then the Queen's piper played a lament that walked out of the abbey doors and faded slowly into nothing, growing quieter and quieter until it was impossible to say exactly when the music stopped and the silence began again. That fade, that gradual disappearance. If you were paying any attention at all, it cracked something open. After the service, the coffin began its final journey. From Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace, then on to Windsor, where Queen Elizabeth II would be buried beside her husband of over 70 years, Prince Philip, in the King George VI Memorial Chapel. The procession moved through London streets that had been waiting for hours in the cold. People threw flowers as the hearse passed, not in celebration, but in the way that hands reach for something when the heart has no other outlet. The flowers fell on the road, and the car moved through them and kept going. In Windsor, thousands lined the long walk, the great ceremonial road that runs from the town gates up to the castle. A horse named Emma, the Queen's fell pony, was brought to stand near the procession route. She had been the Queen's horse in her later years, one of the animals she had found quiet comfort in on the Balmoral grounds. Nobody had planned for Emma to be there exactly. Someone had simply thought it was right. She stood as the procession passed, ears forward, still, and the country saw that too and felt it. The committal service at St. George's Chapel was a smaller gathering, more intimate. The inner circle of the family and the highest officials of the church. William and Catherine stood close together. The children had remained at Windsor, sparing them the part of the day that carried the heaviest weight. The chapel, which had been the site of so many royal ceremonies across the centuries, held the family in its old stone quiet. The Lord Chamberlain broke his staff of office and placed it on the coffin, a gesture that has been performed at every British royal funeral for hundreds of years, signifying the end of a reign. It is a formal act, but watching it, knowing what it meant, made it something beyond formality. It meant a door was closing. It meant the era it had taken a lifetime to build was now sealed. William watched that staff break and understood with the particular clarity that grief sometimes brings that the transition was not symbolic. It was real. The world was different now. He was different now. Everything that was coming, the weight of the crown, the responsibility of the institution, the need to steer a very old thing through a very new world, had drawn measurably closer. There was no longer a generation between him and the throne. There was only time. He stood in that chapel with his wife, and let the service complete itself. Outside, the crowds began to thin. The day was ending. The gray sky had not cleared, but it had softened somehow, the light going warmer and lower as the afternoon moved toward evening. Somewhere in the streets of London and Windsor, flowers were still piled 5 feet deep against iron gates. The notes tied to them fluttered in the cold air. Children had written in big, careful letters. Old women had written in the trembling handwriting of the very old. People had drawn pictures. People had left photographs. People had left things that had no obvious explanation: a teacup, a corgi toy, a small Union flag. Each one of them was a story no one would ever fully read. But William and Catherine had come, and they had walked through those flowers, and they had read as many of the notes as they possibly could. They had stood with the people and let the people stand with them. And in doing that, in choosing presence over distance in the heaviest week of their royal lives, they had given back to the mourners something they had not entirely expected to receive. They had given them the feeling of being part of it. Not bystanders, not subjects watching from behind a barrier, but people who were part of something that belonged to all of them, together at the same time. After the biggest days, there is always the after, the part that does not get documented, the part where the cameras leave and the ceremonies end and the world moves on to the next thing, and you are still standing in the same place where everything changed, trying to figure out how to begin moving again. The state funeral for Queen Elizabeth II was watched by 4 billion people across the globe. It was the most watched television broadcast in recorded history. And then it was over. The flowers were collected from the palace gates and taken to be composted into the gardens of the royal parks. The barriers came down from the London streets. The foreign dignitaries returned to their countries. The city exhaled and slowly became itself again. And William and Catherine went home to their children. George and Louis and Charlotte were waiting. 3 small people who had been watching their parents carry something enormous for the past 11 days, and who needed, more than anything, for their parents to come back through the door and simply be their parents again. For Charlotte to show her father something she had drawn. For Louis to demand to be picked up. For George, now second in line to the throne of a country he was going to lead one day, to just be 9 years old for a little while without any of it meaning anything beyond that. These are the moments that royalty does not show you. The kitchen table moments. The Tuesday morning moments. The moments that are too ordinary and too private and too genuinely human to ever be photographed or released or shared. But they're the moments that determine who a person actually is. And what the people who worked closely with William and Catherine said in the days and weeks after the Queen's funeral was that these were the moments both of them returned to the fastest and with the greatest relief. Not the palaces, not the titles, the table, the children, the smallness of the real life going on inside the vast formal life. Within a week of the funeral, the official mourning period ended. It was marked quietly by the fact that William and Catherine changed their social media profile photographs from the black Buckingham Palace illustration that had marked the weeks of mourning back to their original images. A small digital gesture. But people noticed it. They noticed it in the way you notice when someone who has been very still for a long time finally exhales. Something has shifted. The worst of it has been formally marked as ended. The work of what comes next has begun. Before the mourning period was officially over, they made one more appearance. A visit to Windsor Guildhall, where they met the volunteers and operational staff who had spent 2 weeks working tirelessly to make the committal service and the thousands of public mourners visiting Windsor feel welcomed and safe. Nobody had asked them to go. There was no protocol requiring it. They went because they wanted to say thank you. They went because gratitude, offered directly to the people who did the unseen work, was the right thing to do. That instinct to say thank you to the people who went unrecognized was not new in them. But It stood out more sharply in that moment than it might have in ordinary circumstances, because the world was watching everything they did with an intensity that had increased with every title and every ceremony. And what they did with all of that attention was use it to shine light on people who spent their working lives in the shadows of great events. In the months that followed, people who had stood in those crowds, who had come to Windsor or London to pay their respects, talked about what the experience had meant to them. And the stories that came back over and over were not the grandest stories. They were not the stories of watching the procession from the best vantage point or getting the best photograph. They were stories about smaller things. A woman who had traveled from Scotland and waited 8 hours in the queue to walk past the Queen's coffin, and what she had felt in the 30 seconds she was in the room with it. A father who had brought his teenage daughter because he had stood in a similar queue when he was a teenager himself with his own father and had wanted to give her the same thing. Not grief exactly, but the feeling of being present for history, of understanding that the world is larger and older and more continuous than any single life. A man who had been standing near the gates at Windsor when William and Catherine came out to walk among the people, and who had not managed to speak to either of them, but had been close enough to watch Catherine read a handwritten note on one of the flower arrangements, and the expression on her face when she read it. That expression, real, unguarded, there. This is what millions of people were responding to, though many of them could not have articulated it in exactly these terms. They were responding to the visible presence of genuine emotion in faces that spent most of their public lives maintaining composure. Not a performance of grief. Not the practiced solemnity of an institution doing its ceremonial duty. Something underneath that. Something that looked like it actually hurt. Because grief, when it is real, is recognizable. It does not look like anything else. And when you're watching it in someone else, something in you recognizes it not with your mind, but with your body. Your chest does something. Your throat does something. You feel it before you understand it. And then you understand it because you have felt it yourself in your own life, in your own losses. William carried a specific grief that the whole world understood without being told. He had lost his mother at 15. He had grown up in public mourning, the most watched boy in the world, walking behind the most watched coffin in the world. And now, 25 years later, he was doing it again. Different person, different procession, but the same gray September sky, the same London streets, the same weight of cameras. He had been made by those 2 September days in ways that were still revealing themselves. And standing between them, walking through the flowers and the silence and the weight of it all, was his wife, who had not been there for the first September but was entirely, unflinchingly present for this one. That partnership, the way they moved through those 11 days as a unit, covering for each other, appearing together, retreating to their children together, returning to the public together, was its own kind of statement. Not a statement they made with words, with presence, with the simple fact of both of them being there every time being there mattered, and not being there when the children needed them more. There's a question that runs underneath all of this, through all the ceremony and the flowers and the crowds and the grief and the cameras. It is a question about what a monarchy is for in the 21st century. What purpose it serves in a world that has democratic governments and elected leaders and little patience for institutions that operate on the logic of hereditary succession. It is a fair question. It is a question that gets asked more sharply every decade, and one that will get asked more sharply still in the years to come. But the answer that kept appearing in those September weeks, in the faces of the people standing in 12-hour queues, in the handwritten notes tied to flowers, in the testimony of the man watching Catherine read a stranger's letter at a gate in Windsor, was something simpler and older than political theory. It was about the need for shared symbol. The need for something that stands outside the ordinary business of governance and competition and daily life, that belongs to everyone equally, that can hold collective memory and collective grief in a form the community can gather around. A monarchy that still earns that role does so not through the size of its palaces or the antiquity of its ceremonies, but through the quality of the people who embody it. Whether those people can be trusted to carry the weight of what is projected onto them, without being crushed by it or hollowed out by it. Whether they can remain human inside an institution that can make humans into symbols. Whether they can walk out through iron gates on a cold afternoon and read a stranger's handwritten note with the kind of attention that says, "This matters. You matter. What you're feeling right now is real, and I'm here with you in it." In those 11 days, William and Catherine answered that question. Not conclusively, not permanently, but at a moment when it needed answering, they answered it. The world watched them do it. And millions of people sitting in living rooms and standing on pavements and watching on phones on the other side of the planet felt something they had not expected to feel about two people they had never met and would never meet. They felt that they knew them. Not the titles, not the uniforms and the carriages and the pearl earrings. The people inside all of it. The man who had been a 15-year-old boy in a suit in September 1997, and the woman who had walked into his life and stayed there, and the family they had built in the years between those two Septembers, and the way they stood together at the edge of something immense and reached for each other's children's hands. In the end, that is what touched millions. Not the spectacle, the realness inside it. And that realness, fragile and hard-won and quietly extraordinary, is what the people who watched from 4 billion screens carried home with them when the gray September day was done and the flowers were beginning to fade and the world moved forward into whatever was coming next. They carried it the way people carry things that are not quite grief and not quite hope, but are somewhere between the two, like the knowledge that loss is real and love is real, and that sometimes in the middle of the most formal and structured of occasions, you can still catch a glimpse of something that is simply unmistakably human. William knew this. Catherine knew this. And the world, watching them together through the long, slow procession of those September days, knew it too.